Welcome back to CSM with Chris.
I'm Jason, and with us today is a former music teacher turned customer success leader at 6sense, Johnny Rabe. Johnny, welcome. We are so excited to have you on the show today. Do you want to introduce the topic that we're going to talk about? I think it's near and dear to your heart. I know we've had a lot of experience with each other talking about this, but what are we talking about with the audience today?
We sure have. And hey, Jason. Hey, Chris. Thanks for having me. We are going to talk about just my favorite topic of all time, forecasting for CS. It's something that is honestly super important, and there is such thing as good and bad forecasting. So I think we'll talk through what are some of the pitfalls, but I think, it's good to get this out there because there's a lot that people can learn. So let's dig in.
Without a doubt. And I think this fits so perfectly. So if you've been following the show this far, if you watched episodes 1, 2, and 3, we often talk about renewals, and it's such a focal point for anybody in CS. So having the perspective of somebody who leads a CS team and what you look for in renewal forecasting, I think will be huge. And on that same token, we'll kick it off with a very simple but very broad reaching question. What are some of the big things you look for in your team's renewal forecast?
Number one thing is consistency. So we are in the moment, basically, I know we'll talk a little bit about cadence, but right now we're basically on a weekly forecast update for any renewal that's 12 months out. Now, this is specific to our business, and I recognize that other businesses may have different requirements and cadences and so on. But for us, that weekly means that we are expecting weekly updates. When an update is missed by even a day, that gets flagged by our system. And so I'd rather know that there is someone at least paying attention to what's going on with the forecast and making those updates regularly versus what the update is. I'm not necessarily needing to see the greatest successes in the world, right? This is forecasting. We need the honesty, and we need it to be consistent and relevant and recent. So if something is older than 7 days, this is customer success. Things can change pretty quickly. So we want to make sure that we are consistent. I'd say that is the most important thing. I'd also say that brevity is key. So getting into I know we sort of talk about tweet length, right? But making sure that your forecasts get to the meat of what's actually happening at the account, that are not essays, right? They're not super long. They touch on the kind of the highest points and the most important points of a relationship and where we're heading for a renewal, and that they're consistent each week.
And when you talk about that, because you talked about there's this trigger when forecasting isn't updated, leadership's obviously looking at it. When you're going into a forecast opportunity, or more so, I know that you're close to the team. So when somebody else is, what are kind of the key questions you're looking to answer that update should try to get across?
Number one thing is any risk. Right. Our job as CSMs is to uncover and, work on any risk that we've seen in our accounts. So if there is any, I want to know, and what we're doing to work against that in a renewal. It depends a little bit on where we are, right? If you're 12 months out versus if you're 1 month out, the expectation of what's in that actual update is going to be different. 12 months out, I want to make sure that we're keeping an eye on adoption, that we have met the right stakeholders, that we have executives connected where needed. Later, it's going to be procurement updates. It's going to be signature. It's going to be any negotiating that's happening. And I should be clear, the negotiating piece, I'd love if it was 5 or 6 months out, not necessarily 1 month out. But the point being that the content of the actual update itself is going to change over time. What I would consider kind of a good update versus not, sort of not a less good update is going to be something that's going to be objective. I don't try and take opinion out of your forecast best you can, right? If I get a forecast that says, oh yeah, this amazing champion, they're super nice and they told me everything they were doing this weekend, I can't wait to talk to them again. It doesn't really help me know if we're gonna renew this account or not. Right? I need to know, who's there, what's happening, why we think this renewal is either going to happen or not. What are the actual unbiased reasons that may or may not happen? And that's what's got to be in that forecast update.
So if you're frequently seeing a qualitative update versus a quantitative update, right? So when you're looking at that, if you just frequently see, hey, met with these 3 people, had a meeting about product usage, things are moving. Versus, saw 20 people log into the platform this week after we had a sales training last Friday. Progress is moving in the right direction. What do you hook into more? If you're seeing that frequent, just oh, hey, I met with this person and we talked about X, does that alarm you if you're not seeing actual quantitative data in a forecast call?
It's a good question. It's hard to answer because it's going to be dependent a little bit on the account too. So let's take your second example here about we've had a bunch of new adoption, right? To me, new adoption is something I'd want to see in a forecast because that implies that we are making more of an impact than perhaps we were in a previous time. it's pretty easy for me to sniff out when a CSM is putting something that feels really positive because they maybe actually don't feel super comfortable about the renewal and they're not sure, but they want to highlight maybe something that's, good, but maybe not very meaty. And that can actually be that sort of first example that you'd given. Hey, had a great call with the team. Everything's good. That doesn't really say much about whether or not this account's going to renew. I'm glad we had a good call. Great calls are great. Love great calls. But they don't necessarily mean that anything's happening, what's going on with that account and that renewal or not. So qualitative, quantitative, I think it's going to depend on what that means in the broader context. Is 20 users a lot? Are there only 25 potential? And so we're like reaching a very high usage number, or is there 150 potential and we're only reaching 20 people, right? Like that context is super important to either qualitative or quantitative updates.
And internally, what does that look like when you're kind of presenting like the forecast outcomes upward to leadership?
Yeah. So one thing for everybody to keep in mind about forecasting in general is that there's a bigger, broader forecasting operating rhythm that's happening. And so my CSMs are forecasting to me, I'm forecasting to my leadership, they're forecasting to their leadership, and then that leadership, which is the head of CS, they're then forecasting it to the rest of the business, which may be going as high as the board. And that's probably going to be very similar to those of you that are in CS that are, thinking about your own forecasts. That's one of the main reasons why consistency is so important, because if there aren't updates, it's possible that those updates then don't get all the way up the chain. So when I think about what I'm bringing to my leadership, it's an understanding that we have what has changed is the main thing. Every week when I submit my forecast, I basically take a summary of anything that is different this week from last week, and I send that over to my boss in a separate Slack message outside of the forecast, just to highlight this is what's changed, right? This is what's different week over week. And that can help them then tell a story to their leadership. Hey, here's across there are 5 of us. So across all these 5 people, here's all the things that have changed. Here are the highlights and the lowlights, right? Forecasting is a story. We have to really be able to tell that because it will change, but it's also something that's going to be really helpful for us to help predict, where we are as a business. So doing good forecasting, telling stories that are, I'd rather the story be true than the story be good, if that makes sense.
At what point when you're doing that upward forecasting, right? So as CSMs, me and Chris obviously are very well versed in making those updates and however often. You then present that upwards to your leadership. How often does your leadership push back on you? And when they do, what do they usually hone in on and why?
Yeah, so great question. So whenever my forecast is ever pushed back on, it's going to be basically one of two things. Either there's something in the sort of near term, so like we're like maybe 1 quarter out, and maybe we haven't made a lot of progress, or there's something that maybe one of my executives is keyed in on that maybe changed about the account and they perceive it maybe a different way than I do, but it would really only matter if that renewal was coming up like in the next 3 months. And what I mean, like an example might be if an executive has a connection with somebody at the account and they met or they see something on LinkedIn, sort of an update, and they know that they feel a certain way about it. And I'm forecasting something that sort of goes against that thought, then there might be some pushback there. The other thing is going to be for my forecast for those renewals that are 3 and 4 quarters out. And again, that's how we're doing it 4 quarters. There are some companies that do it out 2 years. And so you need to, kind of adapt according to what is appropriate for your business. But for us, anything that's 4 quarters out, I'm basically looking at an aggregate renewal rate across my book of business. The individual renewals that far out don't matter as much as the whole pot. So if I have X million dollars that I need to renew all the way in Q4 and I aggregate my forecast and I'm forecasting, 98% of that, however many millions of dollars, somebody's going to ask me about that and say, well, how are you so sure that you're going to forecast, you're going to close 98% of that, 12 months out or 10 months out or whatever it is. And so that would be the only other pushback. So those are the two.
And when we talk about renewals that are nearer terms, like a quarter out, and things change dramatically in the forecast, or it was trending green and goes to red, how can a CSM still look good in terms of how they communicate those changes?
Yeah. So there's 2 things. So one is going to be that we know that change when it happens. So I mentioned consistency, and for us it's weekly, right? So maybe your rhythm is that you're going to be forecasting every Tuesday. But let's say you have a really important call with maybe procurement or something on the following day, that Wednesday. Don't wait a whole week just to update your forecast when something really important has happened in the account, right? Make sure that is known quickly, and it's updated in your forecast. Your manager's aware, right? Be vocal. It can be uncomfortable, especially when something is not going well, but we can't fix things that we don't know about. So we have to be vocal as CSMs. The other thing to do when that happens is to make sure that however you are documenting the history or the story of the account is really up to date. So for us, we use Slack. We have Slack channels for every customer. A lot of times it's very clear what kind of is going on at the account by just scrolling through what's happening in the Slack channel. But sometimes you'll also see that maybe a month has gone by and there's no update, or 2 months have gone by and there's no update. If that's the case, and all of a sudden we see that a renewal is flipping from green to red, so to speak, that Slack channel is going to be popped up and questions are going to be asked about, like, well, what's been going on the last couple of months? So my 2 recommendations are: 1, be vocal, be honest, make it known, and 2, make sure that you have the history of the account buttoned up and documented in your, however you report on that. Now, real quick, before you ask me another question, I got a question for you guys. I want to turn the tables a little bit. Tell me, you guys are individual CSMs. You have this amazing manager. Tell me how you do your own forecasting.
Chris, you want to start?
Yeah. Well, timely updates, I think, like anything that's shifting on an account, updating it then, but also trying to figure out the levers that could impact the renewal. Like looking at the contractual utilization, like, can I predict a certain number that we're going to come down if there's downsell and it's not maybe a full churn, maybe they're just not using some line items, trying to get ahead of any downsell and actually forecast that out. But then being consistent in those updates of what's happening, who am I meeting with, what are the next steps here, and then also who else is already involved. I feel like in CS, we kind of use the term like CYA, which I think is pretty accurate, of trying to just document every step that you're taking. And especially with those renewals that, it's been trending yellow for a while, having those updates consistently in place, especially in alternative mediums like Slack, that we know executives will just kind of thumb through and it's a little bit easier to digest there. But having enough established where kind of the story of what's been happening with this renewal is clear.
Yeah, I think the consistency in having the story is so important. I think for me, when I am doing renewal forecasting, I am wildly conservative. It could be a year away, but if I sniff the slightest hint of like, this might not be going well, they might have bad vibes about us, I call it as a full churn. I'd rather do that early so that way, my manager, leadership team, et cetera, they're all aware, like, hey, there is some risk in this account. We're seeing it early. We want to make sure that we, zoom in a little bit more on them because we have that early sign of risk. So I will always super conservative, calling things full churn. It could be a year plus out. I'm still going to make that call just based off of the current state of that relationship. Second thing for me that's really important is, Johnny, exactly what you noted. Like if you pop into any one of the Slack channels for my customers, you probably won't go more than 3 weeks without seeing an update, right? Most of my customers I'm on a bi-weekly cadence with. As soon as that meeting ends, I put an update into the channel. And then as I'm emailing with them or texting with them, ad hoc meetings and phone calls, I'm updating the channel. So having that historic view of like, here's literally everything as it's happening in one place for people to scroll through and see, that then also gets mirrored onto my Salesforce ops with like the, recent last next steps, et cetera, quick snapshot of what's happened on any given week. So over communication at that point when it comes to a renewal call is so important. And I think it's something that we all should be doing as CSMs, and frequent communication. But I want to ask a question here, Johnny, from your perspective, what's the number one thing that you find most managers hate about doing renewal forecasting?
The number one kind of faux pas, I'll say the forecasting faux pas, the one thing you want to try and avoid as best you can. It's not a problem if, like, so in your example where you want to be super conservative, right? If we want to be super conservative, I'm good with that until we get to a point where it's like, hey, this actually is going to renew. We really should forecast it as such, right? We want to make sure that we're doing that, especially when it's getting closer. So something that we're thinking is maybe conservative and it's not going to close, that then winds up showing the signs that it will. That's great. The reverse is the forecasting faux pas, which is when you have a committed deal, you are committing what you think is going to absolutely close, and you have lots of good justification for it. And then for whatever reason, it doesn't. We want to avoid that as much as humanly possible. That, I think, is the balancing act of forecasting, because you can't just say that nothing is going to close and then just be a hero when stuff just randomly comes in, because that doesn't tell the business the accurate story. But the reverse is also true. We can't be saying a whole bunch of stuff is going to come in and then all of a sudden it falls out, which that second one is actually worse. If you think about kind of what we're trying to get at a forecasting, what we're trying to see. So avoiding situations where you've committed revenue that then falls out, that's going to be the one thing you're going to try and do.
I feel like that's loosely kind of like a lukewarm take, right? Not necessarily a hot take, but I think it makes a lot of sense to be overconfident in your call to the point where I'm saying 200K is going to come in, a month goes and they're like, actually just kidding, zero is coming in, right? So I think that's kind of a good take. Don't be overconfident in your call. Be cautious with what you're saying. I think makes a lot of sense. Chris, give me a hot take about renewal forecasting from a CSM's perspective.
Nothing will be good as asking. I think as much as you can try to forecast the renewal, like just try to have those commercial conversations as often as possible and ask again and again, especially as it approaches the date. They're a business too, they're a budgetary owner. Try to have them answer your forecast call and update on that basis and just keep it consistent. Even though it might seem like an easy like admin task to set off to the side, you'll look really bad if you set that admin task off to the side, they churn, and then your notes from the past like 4 months is just like the placeholder that you set in Salesforce because you didn't want to update that op.
God, that is like, if that is something that's happening and like seriously need to evaluate how you're running your book of business, that's like my nightmare, is to have that situation happen where there's an account that churns and I just haven't done anything, right? Like me as a CSM and how I operate, I want to make sure I have full control and history of context of everything. So that's my nightmare, Chris. So thank you for making me have bad dreams tonight. But knowing that we are well over 15 minutes at this point, Johnny, leave us with 2 wise words of wisdoms. One, from a CSM perspective, right? What are some of the wise words of wisdom for a CSM? And then one for a fellow leader in CS. The floor is yours.
To my CSMs out there, being a good forecaster is a sign of being a great CSM. And it's a skill that's going to take you beyond just CS. Typically, great forecasters are people that have been doing this a long time. So if you're somebody that hasn't been doing this a long time, but you're a great forecaster, you'll come off as somebody who's very mature and understands what exactly is needed in a customer relationship. For my managers out there, you got to know how your company operates. So for example, here we forecast upsells and renewals separately. But if those things are telling different stories, that's a problem. So be sure that you understand what cross-functional partners are also submitting forecasts that may have an impact on your own forecast, and make sure those stories line up.
I love that. That's a great way to end it. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. We hope you've learned something about how renewal forecasting should operate in any given business. If you have feedback for us, we'd love to hear it. But thank you so much. Catch us in the next episode.